Hi, everybody. I am Suzanne Shanahan here at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and thank you for joining me for Reimagining Education, conversations on character, commitment, and community. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative here at Duke, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education, pre-professional and professional education in particular. Please note a couple of things about logistics before we get underway. First, as with everything Zoom, there are often challenges. Please do know that there are folks working behind the scenes who will swiftly jump in to address any challenges that emerge. Second, please submit any questions you have for the speaker through the Q&A mechanism. They will be aggregated and sent on to me to pose directly via the chat mechanism. Please note that we often aggregate questions so that we ensure that as many questions can be addressed as possible. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Johann Neem, an historian of the early modern American Republic. Johann is the chair and professor of history at Western Washington University. With degrees from Brown and UVA, his recent work includes Democracy's Schools, the Rise of Public Education in America, that examines the origins and purposes of American public education between the American Revolution and the Civil War. His first book, Creating a Nation of Joiners, examined the development of civil society in Massachusetts after American independence. He is editor of the Journal of Early Republic. He is on the board of editors for the American Historical Review. He was formerly a senior scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and is an active contributor to the conversation on higher education reform. His most recent book, What is the Point of College? Seeking Purpose in an Age of Reform, will be the focus of today's conversation. So welcome, Johann. So great to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm hoping we can do three things in the conversation. First, kind of explore where the point of college came from, the thinking that led you there, and some of the different points you make. Second, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about how this past year may have changed your thinking, if at all. And then finally, talk about how we might integrate some of your insights into how we as educators do our work.
Wonderful.
Let's just jump right in.
Okay.
What's the main argument you're trying to make in the point of college, and where did it come from in your own thinking?
Yeah, I mean, the main argument I'm trying to make is that colleges and universities have distinctive purposes, and that distinctive purpose, they have, like any institution in any society, including American society, all institutions from the family to businesses to government have multiple purposes. But what distinguishes a college is its commitment to the production and sharing of knowledge. And that means it wants to be a site for intellectual activity. And at the heart of that are the liberal arts and sciences, the basic disciplines that seek to understand the world. For students, that means that going to college is an opportunity to cultivate the intellectual virtues and to gain some skills and knowledge that provide them the capacity to have insight about the natural and human worlds and to ask more sophisticated questions about those worlds. And it's kind of that simple. You ask why I wrote the book, and it didn't originally start as a book. It originally started as kind of a form of journaling. I'm a history professor, and I noticed things were changing. And I, at first, just wanted to bear witness to those changes. I wanted to provide in public some attestation that people are watching and that things we care about are being threatened. Over time, I started to say, I don't want to just be responsive. I want to articulate what those things are, not be a stick in the mud, but rather explain what we want to do so that we can then think about how we might move forward.
Was there, you talk about bearing witness to change. Was there something in particular that changed that sparked your interest, or was this more a progressive erosion in your mind?
Well, there are some particulars. I mean, there were moments when I was an early professor at Western Washington University where there was a meeting of what was then the Higher Education Board, and they came to the town I'm in, Bellingham, Washington, and it was very clear that the last thing on their mind was the core purposes of the university. I mean, they were all interested in technical programs that will produce jobs and cheap programs that will produce degrees. We had a debate of similar type over online education, and particularly schools like Western governors universities that don't have professors. And the purpose of letting that school into Washington State was simply to get more people degrees. But I realized we're not actually talking about education anymore, or the kinds of education that college ought to be. So like there were incidents, but it was also a slow accumulation of realizing that what I thought was core to my being and to the university's being were being pushed to the margins in people's minds.
So early on in the book, you talk about sort of building on a virtue ethics perspective and the work of McIntyre and Sandel. Can you flesh that out a little bit more for us?
Sure. So what I try to say is, institutions like people both have their own virtues. They exist for goods. And if you want to be attentive to what a college is supposed to do, you must pay most attention to the goods it's supposed to produce. But virtues are dispositions as well, right? They're not just do we have this formal curriculum? They're about forming people. And so you need the kinds of spaces where students and professors will engage in the life of the mind. And so, in contrast to a lot of arguments out there to say we need to integrate college into the workplace, no, we need to create a space where the intellectual virtues can be sustained and developed. Instead of saying we need to make everything practical in a very narrow sense, we have to say, no, we have to think about the deeper commitments and ensure that there's a space for those commitments in our society. And the college is the space. It's not the only thing we're doing in the world. It's not the only thing I do in the world, but it's an important thing that happens in our society.
How do you think that just taking, say, Western Washington or other university and college spaces that how prevalent or how sympathetic do you think most people are to that argument who are themselves part of the university? So putting aside legislatures and other economic forces.
I think there's a pretty strong constituent for this idea. I think people wouldn't necessarily frame it their way. I mean, there's an irony in this book, which is I'm saying a lot of professors are virtue ethicists. They're kind of conservatives in a good way, where they themselves would probably define themselves as radicals or pragmatists, right? But I think if you push a little, there's a real commitment to, for example, personal learning, the interactions between mentors and mentees, professors and students. There's a sense that we are engaged in the development of people's hearts and not just their minds, so in character matters. I think where it starts to get a little more stressful is when we talk about which particular ends and which particular kind of character. And then obviously there's, while these shared commitments exist, there's a difference between what a business professor is trying to accomplish, or an education professor or an engineering professor, and maybe what a physicist or a historian are trying to do. And you start to see a little bit more space.
Do you think that, I find it interesting how you describe this notion that many faculty are perhaps very sympathetic to these ideas, but that when it gets down to the nitty gritty, there's lots of variation in terms of which virtues really matter, for example.
Right.
And that creates this space. Is it that space which is allowing the fragmentation that you're describing that enables pragmatic, instrumental, utilitarian forces and kind of the business of college to intervene in the culture of college, if you will? Is that part of the problem that we're seeing? That there's this really tight syncing up on campuses?
I think it's complicated. I mean, I think universities, like any institution, are both shapers and shaped by the world they inhabit. And so at one level, yes, a comprehensive university like Western Washington University, compared to a technical college or a liberal arts college, has missions that are in conflict with each other. Some professors will say preparing people for jobs and looking at our job placement rates is proof of our success. And some professors would say that has no relationship to the job I'm doing, right? Um, at the same time, colleges and universities are opportunistic, and they see, particularly when revenue is tight and public funding is going down, they look for where students want to go. So they treat students as consumers, sometimes disrespectfully. And the legislatures, who do control the purse strings, want to see certain results. So it's a dynamic, but it creates the opportunity because the faculty of a comprehensive university, while they share certain commitments, are not all in agreement on what college is for. And with the growth of sort of professional faculty, the arts and sciences faculty have to make a stronger case and consistently make a case why the center of the university remains, the arts and sciences.
So in a couple of places, you've addressed the issue of meritocracy. Can you describe how you think about meritocracy and how it fits into this broader argument that you're making?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. I mean, I think the place to start is I don't think the purpose of college is to credential people and create hierarchies. I think the purpose of college is to educate people who want a certain kind of education, a liberal education. And that's it. And so, should someone who gets a bachelor's degree go on to medical school or law school or a PhD? Sure. Should someone who gets a bachelor's degree go on and become an entrepreneur or self-employed? Sure. Should someone who gets a bachelor's degree become a barista or a mechanic? Sure, because they're unrelated. One is the job you do to provide a service to society, and these are all skilled jobs and important services. And the other is your education. And so I really think that colleges should be in the business of providing all people, rich, poor, of all colors, first generation, older and younger, these opportunities. And that's the real challenge. And the ways in which, how do you do that when the model we have is really around, one, recreating inequalities in our society, but also creating a hierarchy between the elite schools and the less elite schools, the elite students and the less elite students, and also younger people and older people,
So in your comment there, you've really parsed education from career or education from what we do in life. And would you argue that the conflation of those is part of the challenge of inequality that we now face, or is that too extreme an argument to make for you?
Well, just to be clear, I'm parsing a particular kind of college education. I think you need to be, I can't fix a car. That would require me to get an education that's different than the education I have. And so I respect those who can. But I think the ends of being a mechanic are certain kinds of work. And the ends of college are certain kinds of education. Now, is there spillover effects? Do organizations need people who can think about the human and natural world in complex ways and can write and read? Of course. So college education prepares you for work, and you bring your education to any work you do. It provides the capacity to think about the context in which you're working. It provides skills that you rely on, no matter what you're doing with your life. But I think the idea that college is a form of job training does get in the way because it narrows the possibilities that students bring in their own heads when they arrive and that the public has for what college's transformative potential ought to be.
So underlying sort of the arc of your book, there's a real emphasis on the history of educational reform. And before we were chatting briefly, this is, you did your undergraduate thesis on civic education. And so education in the United States has been a focal interest of yours. How is this moment, if at all, different than this sort of continuous tinkering toward utopia in education in general that we've been engaged in for centuries? Is this a
Sure.
particular moment, or is this part of the broader arc of change?
It is both. I mean, Americans have long struggled over the issue of what kind of education ought to be delivered. So, in my book on the development of public schools in the early 19th century, the origin of public schools between the Revolution and Civil War, you had advocates that said the primary purpose of public schools are civic. You have to educate citizens, and you also have to integrate people in a diverse society so they have a common sensibility as Americans. And you had others who said, and there was often overlap between these groups, but there was also the argument that we want to, in a democracy, provide equal access to the arts and sciences. This elite education should be for the many, not just the few. And so we need ways in which what had been the liberal arts and sciences for the few become the liberal arts and sciences for the many. And then you had pushback. You had voters who said, why am I paying to educate someone else's kid in this useless thing? And why is my child having this thing? So this conversation has been ongoing. You see it in the Moral Act, which tried to create, practical agricultural mechanical colleges, to at some expense to liberal education, although there was still an expectation that there would be liberal education at land-grant schools. There was a clear sense that we want schools to be more practical. I think what's different now is, the Cold War was a moment where the United States had an ideological enemy, and that ideological enemy meant emphasizing democracy, and it required basic research. And so there was a lot of investment both in basic research in the arts and sciences and a commitment to thinking about universities as part of our democratic apparatus. With the end of the Cold War, one could say that that imperative disappeared. And what really mattered was globalization, fears of economic decline, a belief that technological change had made the traditional functions of the university irrelevant. I don't think that's true, but I think, so you've lost, in a sense, the external kind of mandate for what many people look at as a golden age of higher education. In many ways, it was still a discriminatory age. It wasn't golden in all ways, but it was an age of well-funded and accessible public universities, right? And so,
great. Picking up on that a little bit, can you talk about this notion of disruptive innovation and disruptive reform, and what you mean by that and the implications of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my term. It's a term that's a term of the field that comes out of people thinking about other industries and how technological change and market innovation can take an old technology and quickly displace it. And part of the argument is inferior versions come out cheaply, and over time they become better, but they also make the older version slowly go extinct, right? And the argument is that is what is happening or ought to happen in higher education. I think it's an ideology. I think it might be true in Silicon Valley, but why would that necessarily be true about higher education? And if it is true about higher education, we have to ask, what are we going to lose if these inferior products that are able to provide degrees cheaper become dominant? And I guess the last part is they're not very interesting. Most of the models out there, like online schools, some of the for-profit schools that seem to have alternatives, they really kind of look like early 1900s factories, And the point I try to make is what's interesting, if you really want innovation and creativity, a lot of companies are building campuses. And, and so they're trying to Microsoft is trying to pretend you're still in college to maintain your creativity, while colleges are trying to pretend they're Ford in 1900. Ford built a huge campus to pretend it's a college for it, and so maybe colleges actually have more to offer in their most traditional ways than we think for the world we live in today.
That's great. I love that. In the book, you outline sort of 4 options. Can you talk about those with us and in particular, sort of the yoga option, but sort of walk those through with us.
Everyone asked about the yoga option first. Yeah. So basically what I'm arguing at the end, and it's a think piece. I mean, I think the university has been a great asset to American society, but as the American universities become more technical, more instrumental, more focused on job training, where will those who believe in the liberal arts and sciences, who seek knowledge, who want to cultivate those virtues in other people go? So I started to think about four options, and one is what I call the Adam Smith option, which is that much like university lecturers used to be when Adam Smith was a popular lecturer, people get a license to teach, as it were, but then they earn their income through their students, and so there's a kind of market of people out there. A second option I say is philanthropic, which is there'll be more kind of institutions established by philanthropy that would be places like Brookings or the Urban Institute or the American Enterprise Institute. And the danger there is that you're at the whim of large donors, but research universities have always been at some level. I mean, there's a reason Duke is named Duke, right? And so have had the influence of large money. A third one is that we create micro colleges that are really kind of professor-run teaching institutes, and they become artisanal spaces, the way in which we think about, we do artisanal local everything, breweries and clothing and foods. You go to the farmer's market. Well, if we really believe that teaching is this thing that happens intimately, let's stop thinking about the big university. But the yoga one, which is my favorite as well, is the idea that all around America today, there's all these practitioners of knowledge who have networks of knowledge, who produce knowledge, who have students, and they have studios. Yoga studios, karate studios, you have alternative medicine practitioners. And we think this sounds really weird, like a professor is a, kind of stuffy, elite, person with very specialized knowledge. But actually, masseuses and herbalists and yoga and karate people all have. They have people who want to learn their art. They read, they have, they contribute online and in print. They have mentors, they have apprentices, they have masters, they have levels of learning. And actually, this is kind of how the university developed. The university developed out of academies and institutes and salons during the 18th century that don't really look that different in some ways from today's yoga network. And so all of this is kind of an imaginative to say, if the university doesn't support the academy, let's distinguish the purposes of academic life and the ends of academic life from what's increasingly becoming a corporate university. Ideally, the university would restore its core values, its academic values. But how do academics otherwise practice their craft? And if we believe in what we offer, it's possible just, people take yoga lessons, they take karate, they take music lessons at all ages of their life. Maybe they'll want to learn something about the human and natural worlds too.
So as much as I love this yoga option, it feels like each of these is giving up the fight that you're engaged in some way, right?
Sure.
Allowing for this separation of the point of an education from the mission of a university. What are the ways to reassert that core mission in the context of a university? Are there particular strategies you'd advocate? Where do you see people doing a really good job of this, if at all? Are there exemplars?
Sure. I mean, they're meant to be think pieces about just what do you do, right? I'm not really advocating that every professor leave the university.
Of the yoga model, karate studio for academics, yeah.
Yeah, and you bring your mat,
Yep.
and you bring your book, or your petri dish or whatever, and you do your thing. No, I mean, there's all kinds of challenges with that model, but the point is that to remind us that we care about knowledge production and knowledge sharing of a certain kind. We're not the only ones in society who do. And there are ways in which not just the producers of that knowledge, but people will seek out that kind of knowledge. I think you're right that the main goal is conservative, to conserve the core purposes of the universities. Not necessarily all the practices. Sorry about that. Not necessarily all the practices, but the core purposes of the university. And to do that, we struggle. I think right now we're in a particularly difficult moment where one political party in particular sees the university as, the Republicans see the university, and particularly professors, it feels like mine, as hostile to their values. And Democrats for a long time have treated the university primarily for its economic purposes. And so our political leadership has in various different ways become alienated from those commitments after the Cold War ended. I think we see that students still value what we offer. One thing, at Western where I teach, the number of English majors and history majors is growing, not declining, so I think one place to go is to really help students see the opportunities and the joys of intellectual exploration. But I don't know how we change it unless we change some of the dominant rhetoric around it. Unless, students come in, and I have so many first-year students in my class, what's the point of college, in their first quarter of college, and all they've been told all their life is college is about getting a job and your degree is your job. They don't even think, they think you major in the liberal arts because you don't know what you want to do with your life. Like it's a sign of, I've chosen badly. Elite schools are slightly different because then the liberal arts have a kind of status value, and you don't have to worry if you get a degree from certain schools whether you'll get a job on Wall Street. But people at my school do have to worry about what they're going to do after school. So I think part of it is it's very hard to push back against very strong cultural scripts, and changing those cultural scripts will really matter. But I think there are conservatives and liberals and progressives out there, all of whom in different ways see the production of knowledge as essential to a good society. And so tapping into those people, finding ways to bridge the political divide that keeps them from realizing they have a lot in common is really important right now. That's going to be hard, but.
So to talk a little bit more about this class, right? So it's not dissimilar in some ways to Duke students who come in having determined, right, in utero what they want to do in life. And it's an immutable path. They've spent 18 years getting ready to come to Duke to forge their pre-health career, their pre-law, pre-business career. And how do you disrupt that? How do you create a different narrative for them, say in your own class or with students, that is both realistic, but also disruptive?
Sure. One of the things that I'm really happy about, I went to Brown as an undergrad, and one of the things I'm really happy about is they didn't give me the choice to opt out of a liberal education. There are very few opt-outs. So I think one piece is that colleges and universities have to really feel confident that they're offering something worth offering. There's a lot of evidence out there that people with English and history and poli-sci and philosophy and chemistry and biology and physics degrees can run Fortune 500 companies, can become political civic leaders, we have evidence that this model works. What I love about my class is that, I don't assign them my book. I don't assign them anything I write. I assign multiple perspectives, and I kind of go in, and I'm the perspective of the author of the day. And so, I think my students will probably figure out at some point that a history professor may stand somewhere on this. But I've had students say to me, why are you such an advocate of online education? I'm like, I'm not, but I did too good a job at that. But what I try to show them is that their general education has a purpose, whether they agree with it or not, that it emerges out of a tradition of liberal education that has content. And that if they care about these things, Liberal education is not just the absence of purpose, it is the presence of one. And students are very open to it. I mean, it hurts them. I opened the book with a student that almost went into tears in my class when they started to think about what are they supposed to do, because they feel that their choices in college are their choices forever. They have the weight of the world on them. But they also haven't been asked to take their minds seriously. They haven't been asked what kind of education they want. And so I think students are more open to these ideas than we think. But they haven't heard them. A lot of them are just, it's not part of the vocabulary they bring to campus. So I just introduced them to that vocabulary, among others.
Do you have a sense of how well that travels with them through their 4 years at a place like Western Washington? Are you an early voice that gets drowned out later, or do you see it in your students building momentum and creating a different way of thinking about their education?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. I wish that I had done these 4 year long, studies of, and gotten through all the research requirements to be able to track my students. I mean, I could go on and secretly look at what majors they chose. I don't know. I mean, I know the ones that stay in touch with me, and they don't all become liberal arts majors, but they all think about their work in a different way. But they're exceptional in the fact that they still want to talk to me. And I know the ones that choose majors that are, become history majors or minors because they end up in your classes again. So all I have is what they say, and a lot of them don't agree with the idea that that's what they need or want. I mean, students write papers challenging. They say the world has changed, college is outdated. But I think what I try to do is just open a space that says, be aware as you go through your 4 years here, you are making choices and you are choosing one kind of education over another, one kind of really subject formation for yourself over another. You are taking this 4 years of opportunity and deciding what you want to do with it. And, we talk about salary studies, and part of what I try to show them is, every degree gets you to a good place. Yes, certain kinds of engineering degrees will make a higher income, but it's not that these degrees are not all investments economically. And I want that to be liberating for them to say, okay, so really what kind of education do I want? What kind of service do I want to provide to the world? And how will those things work out?
Great. Can we talk a little bit about this past year?
Sure.
Early on in the book, you talk about these are challenging times, and certainly hard to argue this past year was not challenging. Has it altered your thinking? Are you seeing things that you didn't see before, either good or bad? Just a general reflection on the past year and your work in education.
Sure. Well, it's been a hard year. I mean, the historian in me who teaches courses on the Revolution and the early Republic has obviously had, when the Constitution, when questions of political violence and things like that are in the air, there's been a lot of interesting things to talk with about students, about the development of American democracy and its institutions. But from the perspective of higher ed, I mean, I think this year has been challenging. I think what we learned initially when we went online last year, we were told, because we had no idea how sick people would become, professors, students, we were told, do everything asynchronous. We don't know if people can come to campus. We don't know their internet access. It started becoming clear what students wanted was the synchron. They wanted interaction with professors and their peers. They wanted as much of the kind of formative parts of education where you're engaging your mind, but also your heart, you're in a community. And so there was a shift back to that approach, which is extremely labor intensive. It's in some ways harder to teach the same number of students on a screen and have them engage than it is to do it in a classroom. And so you could imagine if doing that is at the heart of what we do, it'd be really expensive to do online in the long term. But at the same time, I think of it as we did our best, but it has not convinced me that we would create the the kind of communities of learning and the kind of spaces where people can step away and devote themselves to some goods that are intellectual goods that are kind of foreign to them at first. And they were foreign to me when I stepped into my college campus in 1992. I didn't know that's what colleges were for. And I remember, the late Von Gregorian, who just died, was president at Brown at the time, and he gave a speech, and I still remember. And I said, "That's what I'm here for. I'm here to learn things." It's kind of fair. And so, but I think what's missing is a lot of the fact that education is personal. It's a kind of mentorship. I think what's missing is some of the richness of the discussions and conversations. I think it's like, a digital file of music doesn't have the same range because they compress it. And I felt that one of the things I've experienced is, okay, we can do some of this, but we're compressing the experience for students. And as a result, they're losing something important. And we really need the campus to provide that. That doesn't mean I haven't learned some things about technology that I might use. It doesn't also mean, one of the things I've learned particularly is, as you had less time with students, you really have to focus on the core of your courses. And that's been a real virtue, like less is more. Really focus on what you want them to learn and the questions you're asking, and get them to be attentive to those things so that they'll really take something, they'll remember what they're taking from their classes. You're not crowding the class with things that ultimately may be less important to you as a professor. So that's been something that I've learned.
So I find this perspective really heartening in a certain way, because one of the concerns I've had is that the kind of business model of college would crowd out the kinds of mentorship and community building that you're saying have almost been reaffirmed. Do you see that and your experience as something that might be more generalized, so that instead of a moment of financial crisis in universities that would lead one to have less mentorship, less one-on-one, we may actually pivot the other way and realize how critical this actually is? Or am I just being too optimistic there?
I hope you're not. I don't know. I think the challenge universities face is students don't know what they're missing till they have it. So when I talk to history majors who are on campus and then they talk, they're missing something. But I've also talked to students of mine who, for example, got their degrees at community college online and then transferred to Western. And those students said to me, I didn't realize there was more until I showed up here. And now I'm sitting in an office talking about my writing, working through some ideas with you. And I had a discussion in my class that was, I could never have had online. And I just didn't realize this was possible. And I think that's the biggest challenge. This is where disruptive innovation is a threat. The inferior, because it's cheaper and faster, can crowd out the superior. And the hope I have is that enough people have realized there's something at stake here, that we can invest in education again. We've done it before. It's not as expensive as people think. We can do it again. We can do it again. And we can do it better. We do need to change. We need to be more accessible. We need to think about ways in which people who have not generally had access can get access to face-to-face learning. We need to make clear that the only way to do face-to-face learning is not from 1 hour and 50-minute periods twice a week, or 1 hour and 20-minute periods 3 times a week during the time that people with children are working or trying to pay their mortgages or not. We need to find other ways. But I think people do want this, right? Again, people go to karate, people go to church, people go to yoga. People commit to things they care about if you can structure it in ways that they can fit it into busy lives. And I think that's what we need to do to start reaching some of the people that turn to online schools.
Great. So I'm going with optimism here.
All right, let's do it.
Let's do it. So one more question about this past year. You wrote a recent piece about American exceptionalism, which was just fabulous. Could you connect that piece a little bit to this argument about higher education and how that might affect the way we think about higher education or its goals, if that's not too big a jump for you.
It's a little bit of a jump. I mean, I think in that piece, what I was trying to say is, I consider myself a patriot and I love America and I'm an immigrant. I was born in India and I teach about the American Revolution. I really believe in the ideals of this country. But what I was trying to argue is if the experience we've had over the last 4 years has taught us anything, it's that the same threats that other countries face, we face because Americans are human beings. And in that way, we're not exceptional, which means the same things that make other societies work, we need. We need social trust. We need a sense of ourselves as a people, which means that we need a culture that is open enough to accept all the diversity, that is also bounded enough so that our diversity doesn't lead to fragmentation, that there's a core there that we share. And I think maybe one way to connect it is, I think Americans have taken our success as a nation for granted because of this myth of exceptionalism. We forget sometimes that the things we've done well are things we've invested in doing well, that institutions are fragile, that we care for them. This is true of universities. If we don't fund them, if we don't support them, if we don't nurture them, they will go away. And the things they provided to help make the United States a leading producer of ideas, of innovation, the kind of flourishing that comes from having an educated public in a democracy, don't just happen. We're not an exceptional people. We have to make that happen in that sense. But I care enough about this country that I hope we do make that happen. And I think sometimes that requires saying, we need to do things. We can't rely on sort of the myth of America to do it. We need to do it as Americans.
It also seems in that argument, it's a really robust defense of the liberal arts in a very central way. And so that's partly why I really appreciated it. And also the return for you to civic education. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a question from the audience. So let's pivot a little bit and see what folks have to say. So asking as a college access advisor, do you believe in the goal of going to college should be shifted to explain to students the value of a liberal arts education? And how do you articulate that to students when the value is not linear? i.e., you graduate with a BA in English and you may end up as a banker, right? So that's fairly counterintuitive to the average 18-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, I end the book with a story of a student who was really struggling in my introductory U.S. history survey, came to me. His parents and his siblings were working in the agricultural fields. They were migrant workers. And he said, why am I studying music and history when I should be with my parents working? And I tried. I mean, these arguments are really hard to convince to someone who, that this weird study of music and history will empower you, not just as a citizen to be more influential in making a kind of world where your siblings and parents have better opportunities because you understand that world, but also empower you because you have knowledge and skills that have market value. And it's very hard because there's an abstraction there that students don't see. I think that the answer has to be, in part, that colleges strip themselves of the degrees that allow students to default out of a liberal education. I mean, that's why I have a chapter on arguing the elimination of the undergraduate business major. I think we shouldn't allow that to happen. It's unethical, is what I say, in terms of the ethos of a college. Not that business is unethical. I think college graduates should go into private business, and that's what we do. We provide goods and services in an economy. That's a responsibility. So it's not an argument against business or even capitalism. It's an argument against the business major as part of the college experience. So I think we have to provide ways in which we limit students' choices. And I think we have to articulate to them and show them stories and narratives of people who have done this and how their degrees help. But I think it is hard because, it's much easier to tell someone at an Ivy League school whose parents went to Ivy League schools and had someone a major A and did all these different things with their lives that it'll work out. It is a challenge.
Yeah.
I don't know how to evade that.
And sort of just to push a little bit more on that, you did a recent book review about 1G students, and I think the relationship between students and their family and community is a really important one. And so there's one piece of it, which is providing students with the information so they understand that one can have a well-paying job as an English graduate, as well as a business graduate or an engineering graduate, for example, that there's a full range of options open. It's another thing really to enable the community to understand that. And
Right.
this is really a familiar refrain of many students I've worked with here at Duke, which is this would be meaningful to my family. This would be meaningful to my community.
Yeah.
And that they don't understand that one can pursue English and be in investment banking, for example. Is there a way, or do you know of places that are doing a particularly good job at that broader education around the value of the liberal arts?
You know, I think the dominant narrative is so powerful that it's hard to push back upon it. I think I struggle with it too. I had a student who was an engineering major, who was an immigrant from Africa, and I met his mother and his aunt downtown. And then he came to me and said, actually, I want to major in psychology. And there was a part of me, he reminded me in parts of myself and my family. And I thought, what are your parents going to say? And I said, are you not good at math? He said, no, I'm great at math. I just like psychology more. Like on one hand, he got the message. On the other hand, I was like, no, don't tell him I taught you that. But I do think that, I think we have a responsibility, and this is where colleges fail. We have a responsibility to convey that message. I didn't know all that when I started college. And I think colleges have a responsibility to really convey clearly why they care about their general education, why they care about the liberal arts and sciences, why they think these subject matters are important. Students need to be educated when they arrive, and they need to have a sense that their understanding of how things work is not actually always accurate. And I think it's not to challenge what their family's aspirations for them, it's to say there are multiple ways to meet those aspirations. And studying what you want or studying something that doesn't seem practical might pay off in the long run. But, I think you also have to admit to students, someone who does a very technical focused field will get off the train and there'll be another subway waiting to get right in. An English major is going to take a few years to find that thing. It's when they get into that job and do well, but you're going to bounce around a little. And, historically that's not unusual, and its costs are minimal, but it feels right now in a time where we think college has to lead to a job like failure. It's simply not failure. It's simply graduating from school and trying to find your career in life. And then I think colleges can do a better job with creating internships and career placement, because we know that helps people get started with this, more effectively when they make that transition. So I think there's also that space to do something kind of more practical.
Yeah, I think there's probably that level of ambiguity can be really overwhelming to someone who's 18, lived a life of success that got them into college. And so this notion of finding your way, in retrospect, seems easier than perhaps
Totally.
18 to 22. Next
Totally.
question. While many students do come in with an instrumental view of college, I've seen students come to value the kind of intellectual inquiry and reflection that a good liberal arts education can offer as a result of excellent, caring teaching that poses questions about purpose and meaning, the big questions, which, as you said, doesn't happen often. Do you think that universities should try to hire more faculty who are interested in teaching in this way, in all disciplines, and or prioritizing faculty that develop approaches to teaching and connecting with students in this way?
Yeah, so a correction. I didn't say that doesn't happen often. I think there's a lot of professors in all fields, not just the liberal arts and sciences, who take very seriously their commitment to their students. I think that particularly, I teach at a public comprehensive university. Teaching is the primary task in my job. I have a high teaching load. Community college professors have a higher teaching load. Most professors spend most of their time thinking and caring about students. We shouldn't generalize. I mean, I think this is true of a lot of Research 1 professors as well, but we certainly shouldn't generalize from Research 1 professors to the kinds of schools that most professors work in and the kinds of experiences most students have. That said, yeah, I mean, I don't think this is a question that it sometimes is posed as teaching versus research. I think it's a question of pedagogy. I think it's a question of, one, helping professors teach, particularly at the introductory level, the questions that really interested them in the first place, so that their passion can be shared and that they remember they started with big questions and then they slowly refined those questions into disciplinary answers because that was a way to remain true to those questions. And we need to help professors do that. We need to encourage professors who do that. I think we need to invest in our introductory courses so they're not big anonymous spaces. That's going to require both administrators and professors to reprioritize a little bit from their specialized courses to some of their general courses. But I don't think, I don't think most professors don't care. I think they care a lot. And it's been clear through the pandemic. I mean, professors have been working overtime to try to provide something worth having to their students. And they've done it. I mean, even if online education, I don't think is as good, that doesn't mean we haven't done anything worth doing and we haven't cared about our students. I mean, people are working really hard. I think professors care a lot. And I think finding how to convey that to students matters, but I don't want to pretend it doesn't happen. It happens all over the place.
So I think there are a couple of really important correctives in that point. One is that faculty do care about students, and perhaps the misperceptions about R1 universities, right, aren't able to generalize across all educators. So I think that's super important. Do you think that faculty within a range of campuses and different kinds of colleges are set up well to do that kind of work? You talked about providing faculty support or training. Do they need more help doing it well? Being able to do this kind of mentoring work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several things. One is one of the things that happened with the development of the modern research university or the modern university is that the care of the self was outsourced from professors to student affairs offices and counseling offices. And, even some professors I've heard say at times, don't come to me with your problems. I'm here to teach you X, this thing. And I think we have to, one, push back against that, both bureaucratically within the university, that professors are responsible for students' hearts and minds, not just their minds. And we have to push back within our culture, which sort of we see ourselves sometimes as, even when we focus on the whole student, we don't fully articulate that we're mentors, that we care about their character development as much as we do about their intellectual development, or we don't realize that their intellectual development is a real character piece. So I think that's right. And I think, I think college teaching has changed. I think most college teachers these days are not the old sage on the stage that people still mock, I think we are much more interactive. We're much more focused on students using their minds, what's called active learning. In some classes they talk about flip the classroom, but for many humanities courses, that was already done. You read something and you discussed it in class, like a lot of the work was done. But I think there are innovations that we can help teach, but I don't think it's rocket science. I think it's helping professors realize the core questions and finding ways to help them articulate those questions in ways that students find interesting. And students are human beings. They have intellects. They care about making the public good. If the questions matter, they will care about history. They will care about physics. They will care about biology. They will care about literature because they're people.
Great. And we have probably time for one final question. So how about this? How would American high schools need to change to prepare students for virtue ethics-based college education rather than a vocational education?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a very good question. And I think part of it has to do with three things. One is, let's accept the limits of what a college education is. It is for this one thing. Does everybody need to do it or want to do it right after high school? No. So we have to start asking, is college for all when they're 18? Is college the only type of education that matters? No, we need people to do lots of things in the society that don't all require a college education. College should be accessible for all who want it at any stage of their life, I believe. But it doesn't have to be the only thing people do. But high schools and high school counselors and high school principals and teachers can remember that high schools exist. And they came to exist in part to expand access to liberal learning. I mean, that was essential to their original mission. And I write about this in Democracy Schools. And because it was essential to their original mission, this democratizing of liberal education, it was seen that this was necessary so that not just the elite had access to these wonderful ways of making sense of the world, and that citizens needed it. And so re-emphasizing the civic and intellectual purposes of education, not just, as sometimes our skills discussions say, the transferable technical tools you'll get, the actual content of understanding the world and the curiosity that comes from learning that there's so much more to know. High schools can do this, and they need to do it, but not just because people need to go to college, but because every American deserves that kind of education. And then they should do what they want to do after high school, because we need lots of kinds of people with lots of kinds of education in our society for it to flourish.
Wonderful. So we've been ending with a question about hope. And so I'd love to hear what you're most hopeful about at this moment in higher education or anything else you might want to share.
Well, it's hard. I mean, it's a little hard to be hopeful, but hope is always against evidence, I guess. And my hope is that the pandemic and the crises that led to the fragmentation of America, that people are tired of hating each other. They're tired of focusing on the pieces they disagree with when there is so much that they do agree with. And that this is a time to recognize that all our institutions, from the nation itself to our universities and our schools, are fragile. And that maybe enough of us will come to remember that we share enough with people we disagree with to work together to rebuild those institutions and to care for them. That is my hope.
That's a wonderful aspiration. And so with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This has been great fun.
Thank you.
Throughout, little bits of your Brown education popped through. So really imprinted quite a bit there. So thank you for that. And for those of us who joined us today, next week we have Barry Schwartz on how can higher education cultivate practical wisdom. And so thank you very much. It's been fun chatting.
Thank you so much.
Have a good afternoon.